The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, and thank you for everyone who is attending this second public informational meeting on the Fitchhrona Road in Goose Lake Watershed Study. In the times we have now, there's a lot of different technology and that gets involved to put a presentation like this on, and we sincerely hope that we have found the best kind of format to present the information for this evening. As I said, this is a public information meeting for the Fitchrona Road Goose Lake drainage study. And I want to first make an introduction for the team members that you will be seeing and hearing tonight to give the presentation. First, I'll let you know that this is a study that's sponsored by both the city of Fitchburg and the town of Verona, and are through a selection process. We have obtained the services of a consulting engineer, which is AE2S, and Anne Marie Kirch will be. She's the project manager and will be doing quite a bit of the presentation this evening. And the next person that will be speaking will be Claudia Guy, who is the environmental engineer for the city of Fitchburg. My name is, again, is Chris Barnes. I'm the Public Works manager for the town of Verona. And then also joining us tonight is Amber Liefers, who is the water resources engineer, also with AE2S. There is a format this evening to ask questions, and during the presentation, on the right side of your screen, you will be able to access a little box where it says questions, and you can type those in there, and then we will be looking at those questions that are put forward and answering those. There'll be two opportunities, that one sort of in the middle of the presentation, there's questions about background and things of that nature, and then also at the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions. After after this meeting, you can always email either Claudia or myself, and at our city and town email addresses, and these will also be on display at the end of the presentation, so you don't need to worry about writing them down right now. And just as a little background on the study, there's been a history of drainage issues in the Fitchrona Road, Goose Lake area, and in the last 15 years, the road has been closed to traffic a number of times due to the flooding, which is not only an inconvenience for motorists, but also is a public safety issue for emergency access. There's been a few different little studies and ideas about how to correct the capacity issue of both the flooding of Fitchrona Road and the high water levels in Goose Lake. And they've sort of been Band-Aid approaches up until this point. So as we looked at a more comprehensive way to address the water levels in this area, we have to look at hydrology and some of the rainfall and natural events that occur. And Claudia Guy is going to give some background history on hydrology and watersheds and the importance of stormwater and drainage management. I'm going to turn it over to Claudia now.
All right, thank you, Chris. So I did notice we're having a little bit of background noise there. If there's anyone who is not muted, if you could mute yourself now. As Chris said, I was just going to take a moment to go over a few concepts that I hope will be helpful in understanding the alternates that are presented tonight. We do have a very technical presentation tonight, so I hope that this will be helpful for folks who are joining. I saw that we do have a few technical experts joining us today, so please bear with me. This might be very simplified for you, but I do hope that this will be helpful for less technical folks who are joining. All right. So I wanted to start off with a scenario that we're all familiar with, which is we see here a bathtub, and when you turn water on, water can enter the bathtub, and it will eventually rise to the elevation of the drain. And if water is able to exit the bathtub as quickly as it is entering, then water will generally stay at the elevation of the drain until the water is turned off. However, if you were to turn on, or if you were to turn on the faucet, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to close a couple windows here because I can't see my screen. All right. So as long as water can exit the tub as quickly as it enters, the water level will initially rise to the level of the drain and then remain at that elevation. And if you turn up the water, then you'll see that water will leave the tub more quickly, but if water is entering the tub more quickly than it's exiting, then the water level will eventually rise. So you'll see here that the water level is rising, and then eventually it will find a place where it can overflow the tub. So this was depicted by arrows. You see 5 arrows entering the tub and only 3 are exiting, so that's why we had that rise in elevation within the tub. So you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with the Fitchrona Road flood study? So it's a pretty good analogy for a pond. And in this case, you can see the pond has a culvert, which is leaving the pond. And if it were to rain, then water would enter the pond. And if it's a light enough rain, then water is able to exit the pond. And the elevation of water within the pond might not be terribly affected during that rainstorm event. However, if you have a much more intense rainfall event, then more water will be entering the system. And potentially, you will have more water entering than can exit. And when that happens, the water level will begin to rise, as we saw in the tub scenario, and it will rise again to the point that it finds a natural overflow path. In this case, there's an earthen berm there, and water will eventually overflow downstream. And you can see in this scenario that the trees to the left of the pond have now been inundated. And if you can imagine that instead of trees, you have a road with cars on the road, then you can see the problem that might occur when you have this scenario. So, how can we avoid flooding in the roadway? One option is, of course, to install a larger pipe, which will allow us to send water downstream more quickly. So for heavier rainstorm events, we will have the capacity to send that down more quickly. A second option is to add flood storage capacity. So in the original scenario, you can see that the culvert is at the elevation shown, and that the water surface elevation in the pond is generally at the elevation of the culvert because it will exit at that point. So when it starts to rain, that's the starting elevation of the pond, and there's a certain amount of space vertical rise that the pond can go before it overtops. So if you were to install a lower culvert, then the normal pool elevation would be lower, so you would have more capacity for that pond to absorb a rainfall event before causing inundation of a nearby roadway. And another quick concept that I just wanted to cover briefly is that there might be multiple constrictions that are downstream of the roadway that might cause water to back up. So it's not necessarily just one pipe downstream of the pond. It could be multiple pipes. It could be narrow constrictions, such as narrow ditches, things like that, which could cause water to back up. So another thing that we're going to talk about a lot in this presentation is storm frequency. So when we do our modeling, one of the ways that we do that is by modeling different storm events. And basically, to explain to you what a storm event is, if you were to put a pot in your backyard on your porch and you kept it there for an entire storm event, and at the end of it, you would have water in that pot. And if you measured the amount of water that you had in there, and for example, say you had 2.49 inches in that pot and it rained for 24 hours, we would call that, in Dane County, that is classified as a 1-year, 24-hour storm event. But if you had, for example, a more intense rain event, the amount of water in your pot might be 6.66 inches over the same duration. And we would call that a 100-year, 24-hour storm event. Thank you. So what does that really mean when you say the 100-year storm event? When we talk about storm events, what we mean is the risk for a given rainfall total. So the 100-year storm has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year, and the 2-year storm event has a 50% chance of occurring in any given year. So one thing that's important to note here is that it's the probability happens every single year. If you have a 100-year storm event 1 year, that doesn't mean that you're never going to have that storm event for another 100 years. Every single year, you still have a 1% chance of experiencing that storm event. And with a 2-year storm, it's like flipping a coin. You have a 50% chance of having that storm event occur any given year. So another thing that I wanted to just touch on very quickly is this Palmer Drought Severity Index, which basically just shows the wet years and dry years. If it's near normal, then you would not see a bar appear at all, but if it's on the drier side, then you would see a red bar appear here, and if it's on the greener side, if it's on the wetter side, then you would see a green bar appear here. And the higher the bar, the more wet or dry it is. And one thing that's interesting to note is that since the 1990s, you can see that you're having a lot more green show up in that area than red, and the bars are much higher in that area as well. So what that means is that we are experiencing wetter years, at least for the last 20 years, and you can see in the last 3-year time frame, it's really been the wettest that it's been since this has been recorded, which is 1900. Another quick concept that I wanted to go over, so how much water is actually getting to the pond. As you know, rain falls on the ground and then it eventually comes to your pond. One concept that I wanted to cover was what a watershed is. So a watershed is the area of land that drains to a single point. So in this image, the point that everything drains to is that red dot, and the watershed is the the dashed yellow line. And you can see that if rain falls in anywhere within that watershed, it will eventually find its way to that red dot. And if the rain falls outside of the watershed, it will not flow to that red dot. So what that looks like for the Goose Lake area is that red area there is the area that drains to the upstream end of Goose Lake. The orange area is the area that drains to Goose Lake, so it's the area that drains to the point on the downstream end of Goose Lake. And the yellow area is the area that drains to the culvert under US Highway 18151. And there are several factors that affect how much water actually gets to any given point. And those factors are listed here. Drainage area is, of course, a big factor: rainfall intensity, duration distribution, soil types, land use, open channel or storm sewer, and the slope of the watershed. Just a few examples there. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Anne Marie Kirsch to give a project update.
Good evening, I'm Anne Marie Kirsch, and just a moment here, and I will share my screen with you. We're good? Okay, so I'm going back to what Chris was talking about in the purpose of the study, and kind of tying this all together. As he mentioned, Fitchrona Road has flooded frequently over the past several years. And originally, the city of Fitchburg was looking at replacing some of the pipes, like Claudia talked about earlier, under Fitchrona Road to make the drainage under the road itself better. But as the project progressed, they started looking at it and said, well, is there really anywhere for the water to go? As that graph with the green and red showed, that there's been so much water in the watershed for so many years that even if you put bigger pipes under Fitchrona Road, that water is not going to translate downstream any better than it has been. So we have looked at doing, how's this going? There we go. So looking at a couple of different options, and we talked about them last public information meeting, and we're going to revisit those as well as some new options that we looked at. So first, part of the previous public information meeting was to reach out to you, the residents, to say, hey, what have you noticed? And so we sent out a survey, 123, that asked some questions about frequency of flooding, what you felt the causes of flooding were, did you have a sump pump, and if so, how often was it running? And what was nice too is that we were able to geolocate those responses, so we could see the patterns in the neighborhood. Overall, we had 11 respondents, 7 specifically in the Goose Lake watershed, which is great. And what was nice to see is that the responses to the survey really did reinforce what's been observed by both the town of Verona and the city of Fitchburg. So it made us feel like we're really on the right path with looking at these downstream issues. So as Claudia was talking about, the water flowing through the system, it takes kind of a bumpy road downstream, so to speak. On the lower right-hand side of this image, you'll see the profile. So this is as if you had drawn a line along the flow path to see where the water is high and where the water stands. So up here at number 1, we have Goose Lake. Goose Lake drains right here through a set of twin smaller pipes that at one point had backflow preventers on them, but one is open and one no longer exists. Under high flow events, the water will overflow the pedestrian path there, where then it travels through a set of semi-connected wetland area. That's number 2. So it goes down, 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 and then it travels under a larger bridge under the Military Ridge bike path, but that's not the real constriction. The real constriction is that the water then flows back up to the northeast to number 3 here, and this is US Highway 18151. Again, this is, you're looking through a section of the roadway. And this is only a 30-inch culvert pipe, so this is very small and very constrictive. The water then flows through the narrow ditch between US Highway 18151 and the City of Madison Regional Pond. So these are separated to the point where then the flow joins what flows out of the regional pond at number 5 and through a triple cell. So that's a big rectangular box culvert that are, I think the size is approximately 8 feet by 8 feet for each cell. And that's really where this section of Badger Mill Creek starts, and then Goose Lake is combined with the flow from Badger Mill Creek. So what does this mean in terms of existing conditions? On the upstream here at the low point on Fitchrona Road, the lowest road surface elevation is approximately 962.5 feet. For the 100-year event, again, what Claudia was talking about, that 1% chance storm occurring, the predicted water surface elevation for Goose Lake is approximately 965.2 feet, which results in about 2.7 feet of flooding at the low point of Fitchrona Road. Then the water surface elevation continues to go down as you go downstream, where we have a water surface elevation of about 963.1 in the wetline complex. Now, we have water flowing through the culvert and back along US Highway 151 and back under, sorry, I forgot, I need to do my, okay. Can you see my highlighter? There we go. Water is then flowing back along through the 30-inch culvert, through the ditch, back through the culvert. But in addition, there's a natural overflow point here, which is at 962.5 feet. This is the same elevation as the low point in Fitchrona Road. And during these high flow events, we see an overflow of approximately what's called 120 cubic feet per second. This is a rate of flow, just like gallons per minute. If you can imagine, 1 cubic foot is almost 7 gallons or so, 7 gallons per second. So looking at this, we looked at not just the 100-year event, but we also looked at the more frequent storms, like the 2-year storm, which has the 50% chance of occurring in any given year, the 5-year storm, which has a 20% chance of occurring in any given year. And based on this analysis, we would expect that Fitchrona Road would be flooded on average about every 8th year at that 962.5 elevation. And as Chris mentioned earlier, we are seeing more frequent flooding. And part of that is, again, tied to the very wet years and the length of time it takes for this system to drain once the flooding has occurred. Because if you get a storm when the water level is already high, that just backs it up even more than would have normally been predicted. So some of the issues we talked about at the first public information meeting, we talked again about the factors that affect the runoff, the size of the watershed, the treatment of the land on it, and so on. And one of the options would be, well, why can't we just raise the road? Raise the road at Fitchrona Road to get it out of the water. Well, the biggest roadblock to that, so to speak, would be US Highway 18151 and the overpass. It's already got low clearance. They have no plans to change the profile of these bridges anytime soon. And Fitchrona Road's becoming more and more of a collector or even a minor arterial in the neighborhood. And then the other issues we're looking at is to not to minimize downstream impacts to the greatest extent possible, and also regulatory considerations, which include both regulatory floodplain issues as well as wetland and waterway impacts that are managed by Wisconsin DNR. So to recap what we talked about last time, our option 1 was to increase downstream conveyance on the existing path through the 30-inch culvert. The second option was to look at downstream conveyance with kind of a shortcut on the downstream side of US Highway 18151. And the third was to increase storage in the system, like Claudia was talking about. What can we do to start with a lower water surface elevation in that tub so we have more room for the water that's coming in? So recap of option 1 would have increased the culvert size here at the outlet to Goose Lake. done some internal channeling and removing some of the roadblocks to drainage between the wetlands, increased the size of the culvert, that 36-inch culvert, which is undersized, or add additional culverts at this location, and do some grading through the ditch along US Highway 18151. Well, as we started looking at this, at first blush, we thought this would work, but it really doesn't matter how big you make that 38-inch culvert or how much grading you do between the wetlands, or if you increase Goose Lake. Because in this case, that triple cell box culvert under US Highway 18151 is still a roadblock. The 100-year water surface elevation at this location is approximately 963.8. So even if you can make everything upstream bigger, like Claudia was talking about, there's still nowhere for the water to go. So we looked at the same thing, and rather than go back through this existing path and go back across the freeway, we said, well, the original plans called for a culvert under this access drive. What happens if we put one there? Well, and this would still include the upsized culverts outside of the downstream end of Goose Lake. It would also include the channeling through the wetland complex. Well, even though the water surface elevation is lower, about 961 for the 100-year on the downstream side of the culvert, and that is lower than the lowest sag point of 962.5. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of work for the water to get through this system. And as it goes through the system, it's still backing up to the elevation that would put Fitchrona Road at risk. So we also looked at storage in the system, and we understand that increasing storage is part of the solution, but not the only part. We still need to deal with these conveyance issues. So what can we do to lower the normal water surface elevation without adversely impacting riparian landowners? And we still need to provide additional downstream conveyance. So with that, we looked at alternative one. There's still a roadblock upstream of the US Highway 18151 culvert. We looked at increasing the downstream conveyance. We still had too many energy losses in the system. We still couldn't force the water downstream fast enough to truly fix it for Fitchrona Road. And increased storage in the system is still part of the story, but not the only part. So looking at this, it really required a fresh approach, which will be the next thing we talk about after we answer any questions that some of you may have so far. So were there any questions? It doesn't look like. Claudia, Amber, or Scott, do you have anything to add before we move on to the next section?
I just would like to add just a little bit of additional thought to the slide of some of the alternatives, 1A and B, and that is.
We're not there yet. Are you talking about the ones that we looked at as originally? Or are you looking ahead?
I was just going to state that that there had been a few different ideas from folks to install a culvert through a driveway along 151, and it had been discussed for a number of years, and that looked like at the time it looked like a cheap and easy solution to providing some relief throughout the system. But as Anne Marie pointed out, there were faults with that particular system and idea.
Okay, so it looks like we have a couple of questions here. Let me pull those over to my other screen, maybe. So it says that the areas in the west of Goose Lake, so south and west, was originally prairie, used to help with burns there. Would it be possible to remove this water and have it flow into Badger Mill? That's a good question, and that's something we're going to talk about in this next section as we go through some of our revised alternatives that we started looking at. So I'm going to hold that question until for a little bit yet. And is it possible to keep some of the runoff from entering Goose Light? That's also a very good question. So as we look at the region here, and I will go back, I think. This area does already have a lot of detention basins. There have been a lot of things constructed with Verona Road. There's the Jamestown Basin next to the wagon trails dog vet hospital, and there's a couple also on the other side of the freeway. So there have been a lot of detention basins, and so that slows down the water, right? But it still doesn't affect the volume, and that's one of the challenges that both Claudia and Chris have as this area of Fitchburg and Verona continues to develop. Because while we can, deal with peak flows, and Dane County is doing a much better job as development continues to occur in terms of groundwater recharge and trying to get that additional runoff back into the ground to try to mimic as natural a system as we have. But we still have a lot of development that happened even before these regulations, increasing the volume. And again, we still have an issue with, we've just had all of these wet years. And that water, the only logical place for it to get to is Goose Lake. And unfortunately, that's kind of the bottom of the hill before it, and it's this kettle area left by melting glaciers. That's one of the challenges that we do have. Amber, do you have anything to add to that?
It from a cost-effective standpoint, it'd be very difficult to essentially divert the runoff around Goose Lake, just because, as Anne Marie said, it's the bottom of the hill, and so you'd have to intercept it and essentially build essentially a large pipe around Goose Lake, and that comes with a fairly high cost.
Okay, so seeing no more questions, I will go ahead with the next section of the presentation. And okay, so this comes to the point where we were talking about, like, well, what can we do to maybe get the water through the system? And so we looked at these two alternatives, alternative 1A, which is still increasing the downstream conveyance at Goose Lake with larger pipes exiting Goose Lake. But we're also looking at grading not just channels between the wetlands in that complex area, but looking at what can we do to encourage overflow at the natural overflow location at the southwest. And then option 1B is the same, except now we're looking at significantly larger outlet structure at Goose Lake, again, to help promote flow out of Goose Lake. So I'm going to show some details on that on the next slide. So alternative 1A includes a set of twin 48-inch pipes right here at Goose Lake. And upstream of the pipes would be a weir wall to keep Goose Lake at its normal water surface elevation that we see today. It also includes, and this is upsized from like twin 24-inch pipes that are there now. And further, we would include channelization in the interiors of this wetland. But this natural overflow elevation, we would lower that to be at an elevation lower than Fitchrona Road to allow water to flow to the southwest to the natural wetland that occurs there, and then back into Badger Mill further downstream. 1B is the same thing, same changes to the internal wetland drainage system as well as this overflow path. But instead of twin 48-inch pipes, this option would have a rectangular box culvert system with 3 cells that are 8 feet wide by 4 feet high, also with the same rear structure to control water surface elevations in Goose Lake. So what are the impacts to this? Alternative 1A with the smaller of the 2 outlet pipes with the twin 48-inch diameter circular pipes reduces the water surface elevation for the 100-year event, again, that 1% chance storm to about 964 feet, which is about a 1.2 foot reduction from the existing conditions. The other big change is that we're reducing the water surface elevation in that interior wetland complex by about 1.4 feet. And then the final major change is that this overflow elevation is 958 feet, and that changes the overflow from 120 CFS to approximately 305 cubic feet per second. And then again, this water would flow through this little wetland and then rejoin Badger Mill Creek downstream here. Alternative 1B, the big change is that the triple cell box culverts have a significant impact on releasing water from Goose Lake itself. And now for the 100-year event, again, the 1% chance storm, the water surface elevation is reduced to 962.9, which is about 4/10, about 5 inches higher than the low point in Fitchrona Road. Again, the water surface elevations in the internal wetlands are reduced, and the overflow to the natural wetland to the southwest is increased to approximately 370 CFS. The other big change that you'll see is not just in elevations, but because the conveyance is improved downstream, it's also a matter of time that allows the time that the road is flooded is greatly reduced. Under current conditions, because the downstream flow is so constricted by that 30-inch pipe, really the only way for water to escape is through infiltration, which is very low because of the types of soils, or evaporation, which takes a long time to evaporate this much water. Now, the good news that comes out of this is that under existing conditions, we talked about this, that we would expect that the Fitchrona Road would be flooded at about the 8-year event. So something that's a little bit more than 10% chance in any given year. Alternative 1A would reduce that flooding to about a 25-year event, or have about a 4% chance of occurring in any given year. And then alternative 1B reduces that flooding to between a 50 and 100-year event. So again, it has less than a 2% chance of occurring in any given year, assuming you're starting with normal water surface elevations in the Goose Lake system. So alternative 2 is similar to alternative 1B, but what we're proposing is to change the downstream discharge location to discharge along Military Ridge Trail. So some details on that. Again, we're seeing the triple cell box culvert out of Goose Lake. We're looking at interior drainage improvements within the internal wetland area. We're looking at a proposed channel excavation again, or lowering this natural knob of this overflow to allow water back out of the wetland system. But instead of allowing it to flow to the southwest, the wetland, a berm would be constructed at this low point to force the water under the existing path with some additional culverts, like so 3 24-inch circular pipes, and then further excavation along the Military Ridge Bike Trail to the point of confluence where these two streams flow together downstream of the Military Ridge Trail. So what does this mean, or what does this do? So in this case, the water surface elevation is about 963 at Goose Lake for, again, the 100-year event, that 1% chance. The water surface elevation is lower, again, in the internally drained wetland areas. And the overflow is increased from approximately 120 CFS to 360 CFS, but is kept along the Military Ridge bike trail. Now, some of the challenges with this is that the bike path, according to modeling, would overtop and would probably require some changes in the elevation of the bike path. And the walking path may also overtop for these very large events. Good news is that people generally aren't walking in the Dane County parks during the 25 or 50 or 100-year events. So with that, now if we look again at the changes in flood protection or the level of service achievable for Fitchrona Road, for alternative 2, we're at about the 50-year event. So what this means to us is that whether the flow flows along Military Ridge bike path or through the natural wetland, it doesn't have a big impact on what's happening in Goose Lake. That the biggest change is just allowing that water out of the system and also letting the water out of Goose Lake itself through a larger outlet structure. So the final piece of this puzzle that we talked about earlier is, well, what can we do to make that include additional storage in the system? And in this case, our outlet structures are much lower than the existing ones, but in order to get them to function during high flow events, we put this kind of weir on there, as well as to keep the regular water surface elevation that everybody's used to. We said, what happens if we can lower that water surface a little bit, water surface elevation a little, by removing that weir and letting water to flow freely through Goose Lake. So in this case, we still have the triple cell box culverts, but we do not have the weir holding. So now in this case, we've lowered the water surface elevation, normal water surface elevation, by about 1.5 feet. Still have the interior drainage improvements, outflow improvements or changes at the natural outflow, culverts draining to Military Ridge and the workaround along Military Ridge. So same thing, we're finding that bike path may also need to be raised to avoid flooding during super high flow events. Might be some impacts to the walking trail during high flow events. The water surface elevation, again, is about 962.7, a little bit higher than the 962.5. But when looking at the tables that we've looked at before, now we're still in between the 50 and 100-year level of protection for Fitchrona Road. So what this is telling us, again, is that changing these outflows really has a big impact on the level of flooding and the duration of flooding on Fitchrona Road. So to wrap this up, we've looked at a number of different concepts that really changed as we started to get into this project. But what we also found is talking to the city and the town, working with Claudia and Chris, that they're kind of looking at, well, what happens if we mix and match? And that might be our best choice. So looking at a combination of alternatives 1A, which was the smaller of the outflow structure, so the twin 48-inch culverts at Fitchrona Road, but keeping the flow to the southwest, and then also lowering Goose Lake by dropping those inverts, the pipe elevations out of Goose Lake. So that's something we're going to talk about a little bit more in our next steps. So one of the big pieces is, so how much is this going to cost? Alternative 1A is about $301,000, all the way up to alternatives 2 and 3, which get into the $600,000 range. And the question is, are you getting that much improvement for that amount of money? And that's what kind of had us look again at this preferred combination of the smaller outlet without the weir to hold the water level up, and still doing the downstream with less construction work downstream. So again, for this type of project, high level costs potentially about a $300,000 project. So now I will keep the presentation, but I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Claudia to talk a little bit more about the next steps.
Thank you, Anne Marie. So for our next steps in this will be to confirm the preferred option of the combination of a 1A and alternate 3. And then go back and look at Fitchrona Road and the design and the impact there, as well as look at some of the impacts of lowering Goose Lake and the impact it would have on the riparian property owners, shoreline, water access, things of that nature. Then the next step would then be to meet with the DNR and look at permitting requirements. What would be required for us to do the work. Then there are some grant funds that may be available. There'd be a process that we could look for, specifically some FEMA grants for high hazard mitigation, and this may qualify as that type of a project. And then we would have some decision points, and that would be, buy-in for this amongst all the stakeholders that would represent not only the town and the city, but Dane County, they're a property owner, the Metropolitan Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District. They have a pump station in this area, so they also have some stake in this project. And between a buy-in of stakeholders and looking at funding sources, then we would move on and determine the best way that we could fund it and a schedule, and move through design and construction if the stakeholders wanted to move forward. And then I'll give it to if Claudia has any additional comments.
No, I think you did a great job evaluating and discussing the next steps there. As Chris mentioned, there is a decision point that will need to be made in the future on if this is a project that the city and town and other stakeholders feel is worthwhile and something that we want to pursue. So more to come on that.
And we'll see if there's if we have any follow-up questions on the technical aspect of the alternatives.
Sure, I've seen a number of questions pop up here. A couple of them relate to, what are the impacts or the effects of increasing the volume of water going downstream into Badger Mill Creek. And I'll have Anne Marie answer that question.
Okay, so there's two different things that are going on here. One is the volume, which is how much water, and we're not changing the volume, but what we are looking at is possibly modifying the flow, how fast and when water arrives. And yes, this is an issue that we're still, working with the city and the town. We definitely need to talk with impacted property owners. The question is, water is getting there one way or another. And the question is, the challenge is we've talked with DNR in terms of floodplains. And the original floodplain analysis didn't account for any of the storage in the system of Goose Lake or the wetlands. So regulatorily, we're not changing anything. But the question comes up in the real world, are we are we affecting how people are perceiving the water and how it's reaching their property? And the answer is it may be, but there may also be some more optimization that happens. And all the numbers that we put out there that show the increase in flow rates, again, are looking at the 100-year event. And the question is maybe more of what would we see on a quote unquote normal event, you know, in the 2 and 5 and 100-year. And that may also, it's information we have, we didn't present it, that might be a little more illustrative. Amber, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's certainly a challenging area. The main thing is that, you know, there are currently impacts to you know, a major road, and essentially the only way to work through that is to move that water through the system quicker. And so yeah, like Anne Marie said, you know, there's potentially a little bit more optimization that can happen that, you know, if this project were to move through preliminary and final design would certainly occur. So I see another question here. Would these changes help keep the elevation of Goose Lake more consistent? And then the kind of follow-up question to that is, was the quality of the water in Goose Lake considered at all? And I'll have Anne Marie respond to the Goose Lake elevation question, and then I'll turn it over to Claudia if she's still on.
Yeah, the answer is yes. If you have an outlet that the water can actually get out, the water will remain more constant on a regular basis. You won't get these huge fluctuations where the water will stack up an extra 3 feet and stay there and stay there and stay there and stay there forever. Lowering that outfall will allow water to come out on a more regular basis, stabilizing the lake level elevation. Did you want to take the water quality, or do you want me to?
Claudia, are you still on mic?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
So the way that water quality is addressed for the watershed upstream of Goose Lake is through the ponds, the wet ponds that are available upstream. And the way that works is as water flows through upstream wet ponds, solids are able to settle out. And that is what cleans the water before it gets to Goose Lake. And the things that we're doing won't, unless someone else can think of a reason why, I can't think of a reason why what we're doing would impact water quality for Goose Lake.
Yeah, this project would not impact water quality on Goose Lake. And you know, and Marie had mentioned this too there, and Claudia, you had mentioned it too, of, you know, there's significant stormwater management facilities upstream to help with water quality coming into Goose Lake. So another question come up related to the 18151 culverts, and would these changes impact or change the culverts under 18151 at all? Anne Marie, I'll have you answer that question.
Okay, I'm not muted. Okay. No, we would still keep the culverts in place and there would still be some flow through them. What we would actually recommend, though, is on that 30-inch pipe that's on the north side where the water flows towards the regional detention pond, but not into it. We would really recommend backflow preventers or a backflow valve, because our modeling actually showed during the 100-year event that water was actually coming in the backwards direction. More was coming into Goose Lake and the internal wetlands than was able to travel out. So that would be the one recommendation that we would make.
Yeah. All right, and let's see here. A couple more questions have shown up. What water level would be needed to get normal lake level below the lot lines of the properties along Goose Lake? And I'll take a look at the map here, and I'll because I don't think any of us have that answer right in front of us. So I'll look on here while we go to the next question. Says our 6-foot diameter culvert reaches over capacity, flooding over into the ag fields now. Increasing the flow will wash out the culvert and destroy the fields. I'm assuming, I don't know exactly, and I'll see if I can send a message. I'll see if I can send a message on that one.
And I think, Chris, is this the area that we were talking about earlier today?
We have a little trouble hearing clearly in the council chamber. If you'd repeat
okay.
it.
This is talking about the 6-foot diameter culvert reaches over capacity, flooding over into ag fields now. Increasing the flow will wash out the culvert and destroy the fields. So we would need some more information on the location of that. And I think that maybe this is something that we should follow up individually after the meeting, so we make sure that we're all speaking about the same area.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer, because we'd have to look at this area just a little closer, and it's a little bit further downstream than where our immediate study area is.
All right. Another question that I've seen come in here. Has anyone discussed the lowering of land for a larger retention area on the newly acquired county property? Need larger capacity to hold more water downstream. I think this is probably the area southwest of Goose Lake, kind of between Goose Lake and Badger Mill Creek, I think. And I'll take that question. Because Goose Lake and the kind of the downstream wetlands are very much connected, it's harder to do a lot of storage in those areas without it essentially kind of creating its own roadblock going upstream and kind of working against continuing to move water downstream. So yes, it's a possibility, but this whole system is very flat and creates some challenges.
And again, even if you make the bathtub bigger in volume, if you don't lower that elevation, you're not going to achieve a benefit. It's just going to be at that same elevation unless you give it a place to overflow to, because again, the volume will just keep coming in. And the only way for it to disappear, if you don't lower that outlet elevation, would be through evaporation or through infiltration into the land.
I was going to suggest maybe Amber, if you could go back in the slides, you could go back to where that, the map, just kind of point out this area.
I can, just a second. I'm having issues with my
Can we do that?
pointer. I'm trying to get the slides back.
There we go.
This area in here. And this area. Is that what we're?
Yeah, that's what I interpreted the question to be. Yep, the area
Okay.
right where your cursor is.
Right, and the other issue we may have, and I can't answer for sure, but because it is designated parkland, that may introduce some complications. But again, unless you can lower that elevation of the water, the normal water surface elevation, it will fill up over time.
So another question come in related to development to the east of Goose, to the east of Goose Lake along Lacey Road, and whether that additional development is adding flows to Goose Lake. And I'll take this since I'm a little bit familiar with the stormwater management plan, and I'll also open it up to Claudia as well. So the stormwater management system for that development that's happening along Lacey Road has a fair amount of infiltration designed and a lot of kind of local stormwater management systems. And so there's a lot of controls that are already in place to control that runoff. And then a lot of that water goes first to the Quarry Ridge Basin that's to the east of Fitchrona Road, where water can be stored there as well. Claudia, did you want to add anything about that development stormwater management plan?
No, I think you did a good job explaining. It is meeting the regulatory requirements for rate control, for water quality, and for infiltration. And yes, and then it goes to the Jamestown Basin, which provides more water quality before going to Goose Lake.
Got another question. This is kind of more of a logistical question, and I'll turn this one over to Claudia as well, and Chris. Will a copy of the slides be available after the presentation?
Yes, so I will upload a copy of the slides to the link that was on that last slide that Anne Marie was showing. And you'll find a copy of these slides for the first presentation at that link, as well as a recording of that presentation, and I'll do the same for this presentation as well.
And then also, there will be a link on the town webpage as well that'll link back to the city of Fitchburg.
We did get some clarification on the location of that 60-inch culvert. It says it's in Badger Mill Creek at the airport at the intersection of Badger Mill Creek and Sugar. So I think, this is one of the things that we can probably.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation outside of this meeting.
Yeah.
So we're talking.
I think it might be right there.
This guy here?
I think so. So, yeah, we, Bill or Rob will follow up with you after the meeting, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So another question that came in, did we consider diverting water into the Madison sewer pipe that goes to the outfall? And I'll have Anne Marie answer that question.
You mean the return pipe, the effluent pipe that goes in?
I believe so.
That was not a consideration, but I know that I did some analysis looking at this as part of a previous project. And when we start looking at how much flow is really coming out of this pipe, on average, it's about 1 cubic feet per second. And there's no way that this system would have the capacity to divert that flow. And also, this is part of MMSD's regulatory requirements And we really don't want to mess with their monitoring data that they need to do to keep US EPA happy.
Yep. I believe that is all the questions that I have seen come through.
And then Anne Marie, if you don't mind sharing that slide that had my contact information and Chris's contact information.
Yes, let me pull it back up.
If anyone has questions after the presentation, you can contact Chris
Yes,
or myself.
this is the, are we still seeing my
Yes.
screen? Okay, awesome. Yes, there's both Claudia and Chris's contact information. Especially Rob and Bill, please contact them so we can set up a follow-up conversation. It sounds like it's important to make sure that we are not talking past each other.
So, and I will also post that contact information in the chat to everyone as well, so you can copy and paste that as well. So.
Well, not seeing any more questions, I would like to thank everybody for taking time out of their evening today to join us for this meeting. And again, it's really important to us, and we're glad to have heard from you. And we definitely want to follow up if there are any additional questions. And thanks again for your time and interest.
And I would like to say, just on behalf of myself and for Claudia, that we appreciate the time that people put in and especially the questions they put forward, and we'll be looking forward to answering some of those that require more technical answer. And once again, thanks very much for this for the opportunity to present tonight.